So at first glance, these are intimidating looking grammar choices. We definitely have some weird things going on, right? We have semicolons in two answer choices. And then even still, we've got these commas that are kind of moving around. And if you're anything like me, commas are just kind of overwhelming because there are so many rules. But luckily, semicolons have a pretty clear rule. Normally, we use semicolons to separate two complete sentences. So rather than worry about the comma, which has all sorts of craziness that can happen with it, why don't we just focus on this first thing because it's much more straightforward. If there is a complete sentence before the before the semicolon and after the semicolon, then we can say, all right, we need to have a semicolon here to separate those two complete sentences to break them apart and prevent a run-on sentence. Notice too that the way that even so is kind of put into this mix, there's a comma kind of separating it out. So it's also not really that important for understanding the structure of the sentence. It's almost like an add-on. It's an interruption, or it's an introduction or concluding clause. It's extra. So we can kind of read around it too to try to understand what the sentences is saying in a more typical way. So let's see, what do we have here? It is generally true that technological change is a linear process in which once useful technologies are replaced by new and better ones. Could we stop there? Does that sound like we completed a thought? It does to me. The main place where that happens is here. It is generally true that technological change is a linear process. Then notice we have a comma, which is allowing us to add on a which clause. This is a very typical way of getting an extra clause attached to a sentence. We use a comma and some sort of which or a word that is similar to it. So that piece there is extra. Then it sounds like we can just end the sentence after the word once. So here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to read the next part. I'm going to leave out the even so because I think it's going to be an intro clause, but let's listen to the rest and see how it sounds. If it also sounds like a sentence, then we're going to need that semicolon. So we're going to start right here with the reawakening. The reawakening of interest in the steam engine reminds us that ostensibly obsolete technologies may be brought back into service to address society's changing needs. So notice what I did there. I did not read the part in parentheses, because I knew it was going to distract me. And the parentheses, kind of like two commas, are a way of telling me I'm interrupting a thought. And so they're just extra. We can ignore them. I don't want to listen for it because I think it's going to interrupt the flow. And without it, I'm much more likely to hear that I have another complete sentence here. Let me read it one more time. The reawakening of interest in the steam engine reminds us that ostensibly obsolete technologies may be brought back into service to address a society's changing needs. If we want to get grammatical here, the reason it's a sentence is we have a subject, the reawakening of interest, reminds us that these technologies come back, right? So notice what they did. They took that parentheses piece and they stuck it between the subject and the verb, the two things that we need to understand that something is a complete sentence. They put this big, long parentheses piece in the middle, hoping you would lose track of what the sentence was saying and you would think that it wasn't a sentence or you just wouldn't hear what was going on at all. So being able to remove these extra pieces is really helpful. Now that I see that the yellow and the green both are independent clauses, sentences that could stand on their own with a capital letter and a period, I know that commas are not going to be enough to join those two things together. We could use a comma if we had a word like and or but we don't have that here. Even so is not a conjunction in the same way that and, but, or so by itself are. So this is a weirder way to connect sentences. It's going to require a weirder punctuation mark. It's going to require that semicolon. So that leaves us with A and C. And then the real question is, where does the even so go? Is it in A, part of the first sentence, or is it in C, part of the next sentence? So we have to think, this is a transition. What is it doing? How does it transition? So let's just read it with the even so. Maybe we can kind of hear how it's transitioning. So starting from the beginning, it is generally true that technological change is a linear process in which once useful technologies are replaced by new and better ones. Even so, the reawakening of interest in the steam engine reminds us that ostensibly obsolete technologies may be brought back into service to address society's changing needs. So to me, it sounds like we need it to be in the next part, mostly because if it were in the first sentence, then it would be like it's transitioning from something that comes before the yellow. But there is nothing before the yellow. There is no other idea for it to transition from. So that's weird. We see that a lot in transition questions that come later, is that in order for transitions to kind of make sense, no matter where they appear in a sentence, they're always transitioning from the previous sentence. And so that's just a weird quirk of English, especially with complicated transition words like even so, however, furthermore, therefore, things like that. So more about that when we get to transitions, but for now, it's, I think, helpful to just kind of hear that the second piece is kind of like a contradiction a little bit of the first part, right? It is true that technological change is a linear process, right? Old stuff is replaced by new stuff. Even so, still, but, however, the reawakening of interest in the steam engine and old technology reminds us that these things can be brought back into service. So yes, the beginning part is saying that the old stuff is replaced by new stuff, but then that second part is kind of contrasting with that and saying that the old stuff is still important, still interesting in some way. And so even so, which means but is a perfect way to kind of show that contrast, and it needs to be attached to like the second sentence here so that we can make sure it's contrasting with the first. This is a very hard question, especially for the grammar, but this is the hard module, so we should expect this. And the SAT does like this thing where we have to think about the connector placement, whether it's placed in the preceding sentence or in the next sentence. That can affect how we understand the way the sentences are working together. So just keep in mind, this does come up, but it is a rare rule that you don't normally need to worry about. But thinking about how semicolons work as a connector of two sentences, that does come up much more often, so that is a rule you need to memorize.